The Time Before by Ninny Mouse 42. Chapter 1. Unintentionally Intelligent. This was quite dangerous, Dr. Wingwings Gaster knew. Very dangerous, in fact, not to mention illegal. If it were found out, he could quite possibly not only lose his job as the royal scientist, but, well, there was no prison in the underground, but they very well could make one for his imprisonment. Technically, it was only mildly illegal right now, as both DTW subjects 642 and 643 were physically alive but had no souls. A case could be made that the creation of and experimentation on them was not much different than the growth of and experimentation on plants. A knowing dog knew they were no more sentient than one. On top of that, he had not even removed S643 from its suspension tank, and therefore hadn't technically experimented on it at all. There was the small matter that they were made of the organic matter and magic of a living monster, and indeed this matter had to be taken from a living host through some rather unorthodox means. A laser cutter, what might have been considered overdosing on painkillers, and much agonized cursing may or may not have been involved. But, as said living host was Gaster himself and not a random volunteer, he also thought that he could make a rather convincing argument as to why what he was doing was perfectly all right, as far as he was aware, there was no law against cutting out parts of yourself for your own scientific interests, regardless of the holes in his hands. Yes, he was convinced that if he left the project as it was, and if it were discovered, he could wiggle out of any tricky ethical situation he might be put in, especially considering all of his past experience in doing so. Unfortunately, he could not leave the project as it was. The entire purpose of the DTW project was to create a weapon strong enough to destroy humanity once the barrier was broken, and bonus points of said weapon could also break the barrier. But in order to do that, the weapon had to be either one of two things. It could have been a machine of some kind, but Gaster ruled that out not only because that meant the machine would require an operator, but also because the subjects were most certainly not machines. Otherwise, at the very least, the weapon had to have more cognitive capacity than that of a vegetable, which currently neither S642 nor the still suspended S643 had. Fortunately, Gaster had a pretty good idea of how to jumpstart S642's mental ability. Give it a soul, or at least a fraction of one. And if it didn't work, well, he could try something else with S643. There were two problems with this, though. Firstly, souls didn't exactly just grow on trees, ripe for the picking and shoving into clone skeleton monster frames' chests. Secondly, the instant that he put that soul piece into S642, his experiments on it became much, much more illegal. Because no matter how stupid and unintelligent S642 might be, if it had a soul, it was considered sentient. It could feel emotion. And if it could do that, well, after Gaster's last few mishaps involving monster volunteers, the experimentation on sentient monsters had been banned. Gaster had even been made to sit through a 20-minute lecture from Asgore about not experimenting on monsters, regardless of whether or not they volunteered. He had nodded obediently throughout the whole thing, and, at the end, had promised not to do that anymore. That was the whole reason for S642 and S643. He had planned on making a test subject. S642 was the first subject he had attempted to create using living matter instead of monster dust, S643 the second. They were also the first mildly successful attempts out of his 643 tries, hence the DTW subject 642 and then 643. But then there was the whole issue of them being completely incompetent, and not just stupid. Since removing S642 from the suspension tank Gaster had found, it didn't have the intelligence to swallow water that was poured into its mouth. In light of that, a case could even be made that it was less intelligent than a plant, as plants, at the very least, could absorb water, which, again, wouldn't work for what Gaster needed it for. So then, screw illegal. He was going to give S642 a soul. He had a programmable laser cutter, and drugs, and a monster could survive without the full physical form of its soul. And he often spent days on end in his private lab without coming out, so no one would suspect something if he passed out and didn't wake up for several days. He was going to give S642 a soul. Well, okay, no he wasn't. He was going to give S642 a fraction of a soul, just a small piece. If he gave it a whole soul, that would not only kill Gaster himself, but probably give it more intelligence than he wanted it to have. He just wanted it to be smart enough to work efficiently and follow commands. A small shard of his own soul. It worked better than he had expected it to. Granted, there were the side effects. As his soul hadn't yet fully healed, Gaster was almost constantly on painkillers, so much so to the point that some of the other scientists in the lab thought he might be addicted to drugs. On top of that, with a small chunk of his soul gone, his magic capacity had gone down a bit. He'd never had a super incredible amount of stamina in the first place, and while his attacks could pack quite a punch, he never managed to last in a battle for more than 20 to 30 minutes. Now, he supposed, his maximum time would be more around 26 or 27 minutes. Comparing that to the minimum for admittance to the Royal Guard, which was at the very least an hour in sustained combat. Well, he was a scientist, and had no intention of being in war himself ever again. Really, though, it was worth it. Because only hours after inserting the soul fragment into S642, it had already shown a flicker of mental activity. It had also started twitching almost constantly, which, compared to its deathly stillness prior to the soul fragment, Gaster considered to be an improvement. After removing it from the suspension tank that it had originally been grown in, Gaster had been force-feeding it a solution he had concocted that contained all the magic and nutrients it needed to survive. This had been a little tricky, as S642 hadn't even moved so much as to swallow the solution, but that wasn't a problem now. When he had lifted it off the table that had been its residing place for the last month since he had taken it out of suspension, its twitching stopped. That in itself was an achievement for Gaster, as it meant that S642 was most definitely aware of its surroundings, to some degree, and when he had carefully pulled S642's jaw open and started dripping the solution into its mouth, he had been pleasantly astonished to see it actively sucking at the liquid and eventually swallowing it. And when there was none of the solution left, and Gaster had laid it out on the table, it had curled up on its side and gone to sleep. Gaster was, needless to say, incredibly pleased. But that didn't mean he was done. No, his work had only just begun. Because now the S642 was sentient, however minimally, it meant he could get to work on the whole turning it into a weapon thing. On top of that, there were accommodations that needed to be made. He couldn't just leave it lying on the table. It might fall and damage itself. And if it didn't damage itself, it could wander away and get into trouble and then damage itself. So he had to find a way to keep it safe, at least until it was stronger. That wouldn't be too impossibly hard, he supposed. When the lab had been built, Asgore had insisted that a small living quarters be built off the side of Gaster's private lab, as he knew his royal scientist often went overnight, and then over multiple nights, at the lab. Gaster rarely used the room, more often than not spending 2 or 3 nights without sleep and then eventually crashing at his desk, but it would make a decent place to keep S642. There were a few other details, but they were small, and wouldn't be difficult to work out. Gaster was incredibly happy, and the whole True Lab knew it. For nearly the last 10 years, the lab and its staff had been attempting to build the core unit, or the Central Optimal Resource Energy Unit. For the last 5 years, they had designed and built a variety of core prototypes, none of which had worked. In the last week, 3 different prototypes blew up, and Gaster only threatened to fire people 2 times. Normally it was more like 20 times per incident. And he was smiling, complimenting people, actually legitimately looking at proposed designs before discarding them. To be honest, all the scientists were freaked out more than a little bit, and very worried that something bad was about to happen.